In this lecture and the following lecture, I want to sketch out the Islamic world on the eve of the Crusades. Both of these lectures really require us to look back to a number of developments in Islam since the founding of the faith by the Prophet Muhammad. And in this lecture, I wish to outline the development of Islamic institutions from the Prophet through the early Abbasid Caliphate. These are the successors of Muhammad who ruled at Baghdad. The Islamic Empire in the 11th century, as well as the Chinese Empire, were probably the most successful civilizations on the Eurasian landmass. And in 1095, when the Crusaders were 1096, Crusade was called in 1095, but in 1096, when the Crusaders trekked east, many of the lands through which they passed, the Islamic lands, were under the authority of the Abbasid Caliph. The Abbasid Caliphate, to this day, among most Muslims, is seen as a golden age, and rightly so, for a variety of reasons. So in this particular lecture, I would first sketch out the developments, political developments, military, institutional developments from the time of the Prophet to the founding of the Abbasid Caliphate, which centered their capital at Baghdad in Iraq. And in so doing, in many ways, became heirs to the Near Eastern administrative, religious, and institutional traditions that stretch back to the earliest civilizations of Mesopotamia. Then I want to look at some of the achievements of this empire, with particular stress on the diverse religious community that you had in the Abbasid Caliphate. This is an important point to stress because I've mentioned in passing on a few occasions that when the Crusaders arrived in the Near East, large numbers of the population were still Christian. There were also significant Jewish communities, and in the eastern lands of Islam, many were Zoroastrians or Buddhists. Even certain pagan groups, which were legitimized under the Quran, were also existing in large numbers. For instance, in the city of Haran, ancient Karai, there was a pagan group known as the Sabaeans who somehow got themselves legitimated under the Quran, a Quranic passage, and were therefore classified as people of the book, dhimmi, who were protected under Islamic law. Then the third point is to look at the political fragmentation of the Abbasid Caliphate. Ironically, the vision of Muhammad, which I had stressed in several earlier lectures, of a single ummah, community of believers, was fragmented by the time the Crusaders arrived. There were at least two major candidates for caliph, successor. One, the Fatimid caliphs in Cairo, the other, the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad. And this fragmentation of the political and religious authority in the Near East in the time of the First Crusade was a significant factor in the success of the Crusaders. And with that, we'll close this lecture with some thoughts on why this division took place. Now, Muhammad claimed to be the last of a series of prophets in succession from the Hebrew prophets, the Christian prophets. In the Islamic tradition, Isa, that is Jesus, is regarded as the last and greatest of prophets, and his mother Mary is also venerated in the Islamic tradition. I do extensive work in Turkey, and even to this day, there's a tradition around shrines of Mary, early Christian shrines of Mary, of Turkish Muslims tying white paper or cloth to shrubs as a way of ensuring successful childbearing. It's an ancient appeal that goes back to Christian times, carried over into later Muslim times. So that from the start, approximately 610, when Muhammad began to have his visions, Muhammad saw himself as standing very much in the tradition of the Hebrew prophets. At the time, Mecca was a leading caravan center in Western Arabia. It was also home to an important Jewish community, and there are a number of disputes to understand exactly where Muhammad got some of his notions. But Muslims very quickly came to believe that his sayings, so-called surah, which were codified and eventually published in the Quran, were the direct word of God, the direct manifestation of God's will. And Muhammad's preachings were fairly straightforward. They reacted to the pagan cults, especially centered around the Kaaba, which was later rededicated as an Islamic center, blood sacrifice, various other types of offensive rites that were associated with these ancient cults. And he called for a purification of belief, a return to the single God of Abraham, and the submission to God's will. That is Islam, submission. A Muslim is one who submits. Many Christian accounts call their opponents Mohammedans. That's really a misnomer and rather offensive to many Muslims. That implies they worship Muhammad, which no Muslim would ever claim. They worship God. In any case, Muhammad's teachings were not received very successfully in Mecca. He was driven out in 622. He fled to the city of Medina, which is to the north of Mecca and a commercial rival. And at Medina, Muhammad had been invited there, actually, by a group of merchants from Medina, he and his early followers. Muhammad continued to have revelations, and this is a very significant point. Some of these revelations were also connected with what Muslims would call the Sharif, that is the law, the tradition. And from the start, Muhammad's vision was not that of just a prophet, but also of a statesman. Forming a single community, an ummah, the Medinans and the Meccans who had followed Muhammad, eventually prevailed in a series of desultory wars, and Mecca capitulated to the Prophet, and in 630, 632, Mecca was brought in. The various Arabian tribes submitted to Muhammad and recognized him as God's prophet. Now, many of these Muslim tribes probably still retain traditional religious practices. We're not sure what all of these submissions meant. But the significant fact is that for the first time in Arabian history, there was a community that transcended the typical boundaries of just blood and kin. From Muhammad's teaching, a series of successors, since Muhammad left no sons, known as the Rashidun, or rightly guided caliphs, directed the expansion of the Islamic Empire. The expansion was nothing short of spectacular. Within about 2.5 to 3 generations, the first 3 caliphs of Muhammad, that is Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, conquered a world empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Indus. And in the 4th generation, governors of the Islamic Empire pushed into Spain, pushed into Central Asia, and conquered the Indus Valley, that is the former heartland of Hindu civilization. From the start, Islam was associated with jihad, that is religious war. It's in the traditions. There was a distinct division between Dar al-Islam, that is the house of the believers, the house of Islam, those who submitted to the will of God, and Dar al-Harib, that is the house or the abode of war, that is the land of the unbelievers, where it was justified to advance Islam at the expense of the unbelievers. That's an important point to stress. Furthermore, these early conquests confirmed, at least to the leadership in Medina and Mecca, that God did favor the Islamic faith. And by the 11th century, at the time of the Crusades, there was very little doubt that Islam as a world religion had impressive credentials to it. The military victories of the 7th and 8th century alone catapulted this religion to world preeminence. Now, what happened in the Islamic world is this succession crisis complicated the situation quite quickly. There were a series of elections for the first 3 caliphs, and in all of those elections, the prime candidate was a man named Ali, who was the cousin of Muhammad and whose father had actually reared Muhammad. Ali was also married to Muhammad's only child, his daughter Fatima. They had 2 sons, Hassan and Hussein, and furthermore, he was seen as the logical successor, at least by some. The problem was that Ali wasn't very popular with the original leadership of the Muslims. And after being passed over on 2 occasions, much to his resentment, in 657, there was a rebellion of the Arab army in Egypt, which marched on Medina, which was at that point the capital of the empire, and murdered the then reigning caliph, a fellow by the name of Uthman. And the story is he was reading the Quran, which is remarkable because we're not sure if there was a Quran in existence as a single book at the time. But he was murdered, and the army offered the position to Ali. Ali accepted, And he was immediately opposed by the governor in Syria, a relative of Uthman, a man named Muawiyah, who came from the family of the Umayyad, a vast clan that monopolized many of the chief offices of state in the emerging Islamic Empire. This first civil war, which raged for several years, was ended in 661 when extremists killed Ali. Kharijites, as they're known, that is those who go out, who just wanted to get rid of both contenders. And as a result, Muawiyah was left, and he was proclaimed caliph and proceeded to establish a dynastic empire, a dynastic state centered on Damascus. And this is the first succession of hereditary caliphs, centered at Damascus from 661 until the end of the dynasty in about 750. This did not mean that Ali's successors, Ali's followers gave up. Far from it. From the very inception of Islam, there was always alternate rulers to the existing religious authority. These included people who would later be classified as Shiites, Shia, members of the party, that is the partisans of Ali, who increasingly came to see the world in apocalyptic terms. That the overthrow of the existing regime would bring on a new era of purity for Islam. And this feature of Islam has reappeared repeatedly throughout Muslim history. The other group were known as Aliyads. Their objectives were often quite simple. They wanted to replace the existing regime with someone descended from Ali and Fatima. And in some occasions, you get Shiite and Aliyad partisans united. In other cases, they're operating separately. But from the start, the first caliphate faced this opposition. Now, the Umayyad caliphs are not extremely well remembered in the Islamic tradition, and yet they built the first Islamic state. They created the Arabic administration. Abd al-Malik was the caliph to do so. They were also responsible for the assimilation of both the classical, the Sassanid Persian traditions into an emerging Islamic culture. But they were not perceived as pious. They were unpopular among the various dissidents. And furthermore, the Umayyad caliphs were seen as particularly favorable to Arabs. And even within the Arab group, particularly favorable to the Mudar or the northern Arabs, as opposed to the Yaman, the southern Arabs, who were very important as military regiments. They were also seen as not particularly favorable to the Mawali, that is the non-Arab converts to Islam, who increased over the first 3 generations of the Islamic Empire. And finally, the attempts to conquer Constantinople by Umayyad armies in 674, 678, and then again in 717, 718, were just were important, along with a series of other defeats, in compromising the position of this regime. The result was it was overthrown. And the succeeding dynasty were the Abbasids. In a great revolution in 749 to 750, the Eastern Army, this is the army stationed on the frontiers of Central Asia, raised the black flags in important city of Merv in 749, and the various frontier armies, proclaimed the authority of a possible Aliyid pretender and swept across the empire. And they were headed up by a fellow later to take the name of As-Safra, that is the bloodthirsty, who claimed to be descended from Abbas, the uncle of Muhammad. And this army crushed the Umayyad army and occupied Damascus and took over. The Umayyad princes were actually invited to a dinner party and clubbed to death in the face of the victorious As-Safra. And then rugs were thrown over them, and As-Safra and his generals dined on those rugs while the poor groaning Umayyad princes bled to death, hence his name, the bloodthirsty. Well, this transfer of power resulted in an important shift in the axis of Islamic civilization. As-Safra and his successors increasingly drew upon the administrative talent, the intellectual talent, and the resources of Iran and Eastern Islam, including the fabled cities of Central Asia, who were linked across the Tarim Basin to China, that is the important Silk Road, as well as the commercial elites who were linked to India along the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf trade. To this end, there was the establishment by the second Abbasid Caliph, al-Mansur, a new capital at Baghdad on the Tigris River, an immense undertaking. It took many, many years to construct. Reputedly, over 100,000 men were employed every year. Tremendous building materials brought in, much of it in mud brick and glazed tile in the tradition of Mesopotamia. But in 762, Baghdad was commissioned, officially dedicated as the new capital. Well, that shift was important for a number of reasons. One, Baghdad became, and its associated cities, there was later a capital at Samarra to the north for about 50 years, but the cities of Iraq became the engines that fueled economic development in the Islamic Empire. They became some of the most important centers of Islamic trade. Furthermore, by shifting the access from Syria to Iraq, the succeeding Abbasid caliphs also came to depend far more on their Persian subjects. Many of the Mawali, that is the non-Arab converts, came from Persia. They increasingly staffed the administrative posts, and they also brought in various Persian intellectual traditions, ceremonial traditions, and as a result, the Abbasid court and the Abbasid Caliphate has been seen very favorably by later Muslims as sponsoring the proselytizing of Islam. And that gets us to our second point. The Abbasid Caliphate has been remembered fondly because it is seen as the first true Islamic empire, or mulk, kingdom. Not only did the Abbasid caliphs rest their authority on these non-Arab specialists for their administration, they also came to base their military authority on mercenaries and very often slave soldiers recruited along the frontiers, especially Turks, but also Kurds, Europeans who were bought from the slave markets, often people of Slavic origin, Berbers in Western Africa, black Africans, all being bought and brought into the slave armies of the Abbasid Caliph. And why not? These men would be purchased at the age of 14 or 15, trained as Muslims. They had been removed from their home situation and would prove absolutely loyal and devoted to the Caliph. And this would relieve the Caliph, free the Caliph from worrying about the old tribal discontent and rivalries that the Umayyad Caliphs faced in dealing with their Arab regiments. In addition, the Abbasid Caliphs promoted conversion to Islam. There's an enormous amount of debate as to the policy of the first Islamic caliphs toward the non-Muslim populations. It was probably dictated largely by pragmatism. In the initial stages of the conquest, cities that surrendered on terms, and most of them did, were simply not touched. And the Umayyad and even later the Abbasid caliphs used an old technique that goes back to the old Persian Empire, the Sassanid Empire, of running these communities through their religious leaders. So different Christian sectarian groups, once they surrendered, you dealt with their leader. That could be the Armenian Catholicus. It could be the Syrian Patriarch or the Coptic Patriarch in Alexandria. Or it could be the leading Jewish rabbis, if it's a Jewish group that has surrendered. There was a sense that the non-believers should be brought over to the true faith. But there wasn't the compulsion and conversion by the sword that many often assume in early Islamic conquest. Far from it. The vast majority of the population remained not Muslim well into the Abbasid era. On the other hand, the Abbasids did create conditions that encouraged proselytizing, or at least conversion. The construction of Baghdad and the great cities along the Tigris River were one. It became quite clear in the Abbasid era that to feed those huge courts, it was necessary to develop very extensive long-distance trade connections. This is particularly so in the 9th and early 10th century, where there's a vast output of Abbasid coinage. Their coins travel across the Eurasian landmass, and this was because all sorts of commodities, slaves, exotic commodities, building material, silks from China, were all being brought into these centers. By 900, Baghdad was at least 1 million strong. Byzantine envoys coming to the city were stunned and regarded Baghdad as even greater in size and opulence than their own city, Constantinople. And that is high praise indeed, because the Byzantines are not inclined to make such a concession. And that fact alone meant that the Abbasid Caliphate was successful, and those engaged in trade and commerce, contracts, found it increasingly to their advantage to convert to Islam. That would put them under the protection of the Quran and Islamic law. That would also give them the protection of the great authority of the Abbasid Caliph when these merchants left the frontiers of the Abbasid Empire, that is, traveled into Central Asia or other wild places looking for these various goods. So in the terms of the merchant and civic elites in cities across the Islamic Empire, there was a steady conversion over to Islam. In addition, while the Christian communities and the Jewish communities were protected, and in Eastern Islam, the Zoroastrian communities, there were decided advantages. You were freed from a head tax. If you were non-Muslim, you paid a head tax for the price of your faith. Various civil disabilities. No non-Muslim could ride a horse or learn the use of arms. Those so inclined recruited themselves into Muslim armies, eventually converted. Now, that doesn't mean that there was a vast exodus of Christians and Jews into the new faith of Islam, but there was a steady process of conversion that took place across the Islamic world from the 9th through the 11th century, and this process was still in progress when the Crusaders showed up. Now, the Abbasids, in many ways, immensely successful, also proved to fail to establish a successful regime. And the Abbasid dynasty didn't so much fall as their empire began to fragment in the 9th century. Ironically, it fragmented at a time where, in many ways, the cultural and economic achievements had reached a new high order. There are several reasons for this, not the least going back to that initial split in Islam that pitted Sunni, that is, the Orthodox, the ones who followed the right way, those are the followers of Muawiyah, the Abbasids, who went with this line of caliphs, and the Shiite and the Aliyids, those who felt that somewhere along the line, the leadership in Islam went wrong, that Ali was supposed to be the proper successor, and that Ali's descendants should be treated as the imams, that is, the teachers, or in Persian, the Mahdi, who would lead Islam in a pure and rightly guided way. The Abbasids had started their revolution against the Umayyad caliphs under the banner of the Shiite and Aliyid sectarians. But once they took power, they had jettisoned that group and had liquidated them just as ruthlessly as they had liquidated the Umayyad, and took power in their own name. So these groups continued to remain in opposition. And if anything, they flourished. The development of cities and trade connections allowed Shiite and Aliyid groups to set up cells in cities across the Islamic world. These sectarian groups also became quite popular among non-Arab populations, particularly in the fringes. They gained great successes in converting Berbers in Morocco and various tribal groups in the Yemen. So there was always, within the Abbasid Caliphate, these sources of discontent. As sectarians, they also disputed among themselves exactly what was the right way. There was a significant split in this Shiite group that occurred in 765 when the sixth descendant from Hussein, who was one of the sons of Ali, the second son of Ali, and was regarded as the next successor after Ali, that his name was Jafar, that he had two sons, one of them Ishmael and another one Musa, and the Ishmaelites are known as the Seveners, and the Musa is the Twelvers. That is, there is a split within the Shiites of which group you wish to follow. The Twelvers, for instance, are now the basis for many of the Shiite groups in Iran and Iraq today. That was the group that followed Musa in his succession down to 873 when the Imam disappeared and a reign of hidden Imams followed. The invisible Imams who were awaited at the end of the days at the Great Apocalypse. Ishmael's followers, on the other hand, believed that he was the rightful successor, and they organized themselves into a variety of groups. The most famous of them are known as the Nazarites, or more popularly known as the Assassins, who emerged in the 11th century and were extremely good in infiltrating and killing Sunni magistrates and rulers that they found offensive. They had a major fortress at Alamut in the Elburz Mountains just south of the Caspian, and were notorious for sending out hit squads against any Sunni ruler they found offensive. They actually were very good at doing crusaders, too. I think it was in 1152 where two assassins disguised as monks killed Count Raymond II at High Mass. Very, very good deal. Well, finally, one of the most remarkable of these dissident groups were the Fatimids, whom I've mentioned before. The Fatimids were very much within this line of tradition of Shiites and Aliyids. They traced their descent back to Ali and Fatima, hence the name Fatimid. They were descended from Ali and the one and only daughter of Muhammad. And in 909, the leader al-Mahdi, which simply means the inspired one, came out of hiding in Morocco, rallied various Berber forces, and swept across North Africa. This Fatimid success climaxed in 969 when their ex-Greek or Byzantine slave general, a fellow named Jawar, occupied Cairo and took over Egypt. With Egypt fell Mecca and Medina, the holy cities, and Fatimid armies then pushed into Syria and had as their target Baghdad. And for a very brief moment, at one point, the Fatimid armies actually did occupy Baghdad for 40 days. This stunning success meant that the Sunni Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad for the first time faced a really serious Shiite opponent. The Eastern sectarians hailed the Fatimids as their deliverance, particularly the assassins groups. They simply lined up. There were other sectarian groups who operated technically in the name of the reigning Fatimid caliph through the 10th and early 11th century, expecting that these caliphs would usher in a new apocalyptic age of pure Islam. Well, unfortunately, their expectations were not met. While al-Mu'iz, who was the caliph who moved the government to Cairo in 973, officially the Fatimids assumed a position in Cairo, this government very quickly settled into the administrative and political traditions of the Near East. By the early 11th century, certainly by the reign of the notorious Caliph al-Hakim, who signed that treaty with Basil II, the Fatimid caliphs were ruling essentially as the Shiite version of the Abbasid caliphs. Both regimes had caliphs as figureheads. Both regimes had powerful ministers, viziers, military officials. In the case of the Abbasids, these would be Turkish officers. In the case of the Fatimid Caliph, these were often Greek, Slavic, or Berber officers, that is, slave soldiers, who ran the governments. And this, of course, disenchanted the more extreme sectarians. And in a way, by the mid-11th century, the Islamic world was now in a political and religious stalemate. The ideal of a single authority, a single ummah, in the hands of a caliph descended from Muhammad had been shattered. There were now two such caliphs. There's actually a third one. In 929, there was a caliphate set up in Spain, but it was so on the periphery that most Muslims probably didn't pay attention to it. This stalemate would only be broken by an unexpected change, and that is by the arrival, the migration of the Seljuk Turks of Central Asia. who would sweep through the Near East, restore the authority of the Abbasid Caliph, and take on the Fatimid Caliph in the name of Islam. And with the Seljuk Turks came not only a rejuvenation of Islam, but also the decisive attack on the Byzantine Empire that brought down the Byzantine state and ushered in the Crusades.